Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us once again for another episode of The Planning Period. My name is Kyle Hayes. I am a 7 through 12 science educator. Currently, I am teaching the Regents Biology curriculum in the Rochester City School District, and I'm joined today by my lovely wife, Molly.
Hi, my name is Molly Hayes. I am currently a kindergarten teacher as well as a special educator.
And now, Molly, today I would love to talk to you about equitable assessment practices in the science classroom. And I think that's something we can both sort of get behind. As you, as a special educator, a lot of your job is making sure that the playing field is as level as possible for your students, especially when it comes to those assessments, whether they be just a summative at the end of a unit or a big sort of regents exam or formative or common formative assessment that's given at the end of a learning segment. And what I really want to focus in on today is that a lot of the assessments that we see in today's practices are bringing in a bunch of outside factors such as reading level or previous experiences in things like mathematics or just exposure to nature in general in a biology lesson, and how these things can sort of shift the playing field and make it so some students are being given advantages that other students are not.
I really do have to relate to this problem. Data-wise, these assessments need to have reliable data that show an accurate description of what a student's skills are and where we can go from that.
Exactly. So, right, if we are in a science environment, our assessments should show us if these students have the skills that a scientist, a professional, would be expected to have once they reach sort of the culmination of their own field, occupational and professional work. And by the end of this episode, I'm hoping that we can convince teachers to revisit their own assessment practices and think if they are allowing their students to bring their own experiences, their own cultures to the assessment field so that they are being able to show what they have learned and how they have learned it rather than their ability to sort of dissect a text and memorize set facts that the teacher provides for them. We want our students to see the assessment itself as a learning opportunity rather than an opportunity to simply show what they have learned.
So earlier you mentioned about an equitable assessment. Now, can you sort of touch on the difference between maybe like an equality like assessment versus like an equitable assessment?
Well, I think, there's a very common metaphor that I think a lot of teachers have probably seen. Some people call it the soapbox metaphor or the soapbox story or the baseball fence metaphor.
Yep.
Where if you're trying to watch a baseball game, right? I'll ground this in sports like I always do. And you have three brothers, let's say, of different ages, and the youngest can't see over the fence. The middle child is like almost there, but not quite. Maybe if he stands on his tippy toes, he can peer over and see the field. And the oldest child, can just stand there and he can see over the fence, no problem, right? If we wanted equality, we would go and we would get one apple crate or soapbox, whatever it is, and we would put one under each person, right? Each brother.
Equal for them all.
Equal for everybody. But how's that going to end up?
You're going to have a very disappointed little boy who's still not
Who still
able
can't
to
see over the fence.
Right. Yeah, you can't see
And
the baseball game.
The middle brother's happy, but then we've given supports to the oldest son that he didn't need, right? We've diverted energy to create something that we could have spent in creating a more equitable environment. So you want to guess what the equitable solution to this metaphor is?
I am going to assume we are going to, instead of supplying a soapbox for the eldest brother or the tallest brother,
Right.
we're going to give 2 soapboxes to the smallest brother who's not able to see over the fence, and we still give that just one to the kid in the middle. We kind of give everybody what they need so everyone's able to view that baseball game.
Exactly. That's equity. Not everybody has been given the same supports, but everybody has reached the same conclusion, right? Everybody gets to watch the baseball game. And so if we're bringing this back to our standardized exams, right, our Regents tests, everybody who takes the Living Environment Regents exam or, any other science or Regents exam in general, right, they're given the same test, no matter where they come from, what languages they speak. I mean, sure, they're translated, but the test is the same. The questions are the same. And what we're getting from that is we're circling back to that the starting lines are in a different place. A student who might be reading at a 10th grade level is going to perform better than a student who might be reading at a 7th grade level. And I'm going to ask you, do you think that tells us if they are proficient in science, or does that tell us if they're proficient at reading and test taking?
I think it's going to spark some different needs that are not science related. Absolutely.
Exactly. And so what we get on the tail end of this as educators is when we go and we look at the data, all we have is a metric of a student's fact memorization, reading ability, and test-taking strategies, which I don't want to sit here and say that reading level isn't important. Obviously it is, right? You need to be able to read and dissect text in any study, any curriculum. But, again, if this is a science test, if we are using this as a metric to say if this student has achieved proficiency in science and is ready to move on to the next level, then we should cut away those confounding variables and provide students not with standardized tests and classic assessments, but with tasks such as lab practicals, right? You see those more in chemistry. You don't see them that often in biology, especially not at the high school level. Where to gain that proficiency, you are asked to demonstrate a task, right? And in this way, we're grounding our assessments in science. And the data that we get from this is showing us this student has the skills, this student has the ability to operate as a science professional, which at the end of the day is the goal of our public education system, is to create professionals who are confident in their own skills and know what they would like once they get out of high school, out of college, and into that professional field.
So I really do have to ask. So Kyle and I also went to the same school district growing up, K through 12. And I would say that was such a cookie cutter type school. There was, those equal assessments, but there wasn't much equity in that case. Is there a higher need for these equitable assessments in different districts, in different country, states?
It's a great segue. You always know how to tee me up for the next topic. So now that we've covered sort of what equity is and why it's important, let's talk about where it is going to be the most needed, right? And that is going to be where your student body is the most diverse. Because if you have a homogenous group, maybe your country is very sort of like secular in its culture. You don't get a lot of, immigration. You can probably get away with keeping your lessons very homogenous and giving each student the same opportunity. But in places where you have a lot of diversity, like here in America, you are going to need to modify your assessments more so than somewhere that has less diversity. And that is because a big part of equity is being culturally relevant, right? A good example that I see is in a physics test, right? You might give a question where you're calculating the force of a baseball being thrown and hit by a batter, right? And the baseball's, moving at 90 miles an hour and the swing is at 60. So what's the exit velocity of the ball, right? That would be a standard physics question.
Sure.
But what if you're giving that question to a kid who's from a country where baseball is not a popular sport?
Yeah.
Right? That automatically right there, you're putting in a variable that might confuse that child, right? And it makes it hard for them to form a picture in their head and to start, actually seeing the system and how it would play out so they can begin their thinking. So in a diverse group, right, you're going to want to steer away from those sort of culturally relevant examples and either modify your questions so that each one is in a situation where the student is comfortable, or you might allow the student to come up with something that is actually, here's something in my life where I observe forces, right? We're still meeting the same standard, and we're still creating data for ourselves as educators, and we're still observing the student. And this is actually when I did my research into equitable assessment. What I found was that most of the papers I was reading are from very diverse areas, right? I didn't see a lot of research from places like Finland or Norway or those Nordic countries that have really robust and lauded education systems, but also a very homogeneous population, right? What I saw was a lot of research out of places like Turkey, right? Where this researcher Kamal Isi, and I hope I'm saying that right, posted a survey of teachers who are about to graduate into the professional world. They were, juniors and seniors in their collegiate programs. And he was showing data where 86% of their teachers were being taught about equitable assessment. And they understood the importance of that cultural outreach, right?
Oh no, what's the percentage of the teachers actually giving those assessments?
Well, that is, it was about somewhere in the 70% of teachers who are actually giving those assessments. So there is, a little bit of a downplay of people who say, yes, this is important, and people who say, yes, I'm actually doing this.
Right.
But, when you see those diverse needs, you're talking about you need to prepare your teachers to meet those diverse needs.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, did you, when you were in college, was equitable assessment something that you were trained for?
I saw a lot of it in my master's program, to be quite honest with you. I felt like my undergrad was a lot of prep for this is what it looks like to be in a classroom. But my master's actually took the time to dive in. You're in the classroom now. You're doing it. You've done it. Let's think about all of the important aspects, and those equitable assessments and cultural relevance really, really do pop up, and it have really shifted the way I've taught my students and have modified for my students with different needs.
Yeah, and so the student voice. Right?
Absolutely.
You got to let your students show you how they are going to be best serviced. And that is also something that came up a lot in my research. So I read this great paper by a team led by a man named Misbah Javed from his work on Pakistan and from his work in Pakistan. And they use a traditional assessment system in a very similar way that New York does. And he took a risk, as teachers who want to make serious change often do, and he moved away from the curriculum. And at the start of the year, he surveyed all of his students. And he said, how would you like to be taught? And especially when it came to assessments, he would provide the students with the assessment that, Pakistan would like him to give. And he allowed his students to reform it in a way that they felt represented them, right? And so there's metrics that need to be met, right? We still need to be meeting the same standards. So if I was to give a test on natural selection, right, I could give my kids 10 multiple choice questions about natural selection and a short answer analysis, and we could call that an assessment. Or you could let the students, you could give them a lesson on what it is and what it looks like. And you can say, hey, go home this weekend pick an animal that you see around your home, your school, wherever it is, and tell me why it has the traits it has. Go out there, do the research,
Yeah.
create a model, create a presentation that outlines where the pressures are that have molded this organism, where, the positive and negative traits either came in or exited, and how did we get to the organism we have today, right? We're still seeing if the student knows how natural selection works. We're still letting the student have a voice. We're letting them get out there, right? And at the end of the day, we're meeting the same end goal, but the student is more engaged. The student feels recognized. The student feels as though they have created something new and engaging, rather than just being told to sit down, be quiet, pick up the pencil, and wait for the bell to ring. Right?
And I think that also really allows the student to be involved in their community and where they live.
Community outreach is a huge thing. And now I want to get to that in just a second, but I want to get back to Javed's work with this assessment. When we look at the control group, the group that took the same assessment that they always take, and the group that got the treatment, right, the experimental group that got to design their own assessment, what do you think the outcomes were?
I would have to say the students who designed their own assessments probably did.
Yeah, they saw a not only higher overall scores,
Sure.
but also lower gaps between the high performers and the low performers after grading. Right, and what goes even just a bit further is that the students who took the regular assessment, when you cross-referenced their grades with their reading level, you saw a larger gap compared to that student's standard scores on actual work in the classroom, like lab work, right? And so that it's another, point on the scoreboard for showing that our standardized assessments are testing things that are not science. And we are giving our kids a larger amount of stress than they need. We are perhaps putting them in environments that they don't feel comfortable in. And we are placing more work for less payoff and less accurate data. So earlier you mentioned, community outreach, right? And getting students involved in their surroundings, And that brings me to this paper by Kamal Koirala, who worked with a Nepalese school district. And they are a very diverse group. They get a lot of people from China immigrating in and from surrounding countries, India, Pakistan, right? That's the Southeast Asian area. And it's a very diverse group, not only in cultures, but also socioeconomically, right? And we haven't even really talked about how money plays a huge role in a child's, upbringing. Did this child growing up have experiences that furthered their education? Could their parents afford for them to have a writing coach or something, or go to a reading program or a sleepaway camp in the summer, right? Things like that can affect a student's performance. And so what Koirala did is they helped the teachers standardize their grading measures so that the students always knew how they would be graded. And he took their assessments and he changed them in a way where students were being held together and tested on concepts that were based in commonalities that all students shared. In Nepal, agriculture is a major, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's something that pretty much every family does, right? They're growing their own crops. And so they developed soil health and plant growth lessons based around the fields that students were helping their families maintain, right? So not only are they creating healthier spaces and more productive spaces for the community, but they're also in real time learning about soil health and plant growth. And one of the things they mentioned in their work was they developed things around the importance of why you need to put the head of a plow into the soil at a certain angle, right? Now that's more based on math, but it still gets the point across that we are meeting those goals. We are teaching about real world skills while actually practicing those real world skills, right? And so we're taking this diverse group, we are finding something they all understand, and we are basing our work in that, and that carries through to the assessment. And since we've standardized our grading approach, right, the students know what to expect, but it also makes the teachers more comfortable in an equitable environment as well. And so we just talked about 3 pretty diverse countries, right? Turkey, Pakistan, Nepal are very diverse areas. But America should not be left out of this conversation of diversity. I mean, we are the melting pot, right? And we need to bring them into the classroom culture. So what would you say the population percentage of white students is in public school?
You know, I'm not good at numbers.
Just take a guess. Take a guess.
Percentage of
white students, white identifying students in American public schools. This is from the National Foundation of Education.
I'm going to say 45%. Maybe over 50%.
You almost nailed it. It's 44%. It's 44%. Now that is down over the last 4 years from 51%. Right, and that is a steady decline. And yet, when we look at the data, white students outperform their non-white peers at a rather large rate.
Right.
And, there's obviously, we might see some socioeconomic factors in there, but we also have to ask, is it because our assessment strategies are more helpful to white students than non-white students? Right, and we have seen over that same metric, right? Hispanic population has increased from 24 to 29, and Hispanics in and of themselves are an extremely diverse group. Black student population remains pretty stable. It hovers right around the 16-15%. But we also see a increase of families identifying with 2 races. That's climbed from 4 to 7%. Right? We are seeing more diverse classrooms. And as our students change, we need to change. We need to find a way to include these culturally diverse voices into our work as educators. We need to make sure they feel visible, they feel seen. That way they can be engaged and motivated to perform well. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of our research that we did here, when we did equitable assessment, when we did things like project-based learning, modeling-based learning, right, practicing those real skills, we saw that grades for white students remained relatively stable, right, because they were most likely to already be at the finish line. But the non-white, the Black and Hispanic scores increased quite significantly. And it shows that when we get that culturally relevant teaching, when we get practices that the students feel involved in and they feel as though these practices are worthwhile, that exactly what we talked about at the start of the episode, right? We're getting everyone to the same point, or at least a heck of a lot closer than we currently are. So let's talk a little bit about how we can bring equitable assessment into our classroom, right? What are some things that we can do right here, right now, in order to start making change? Because it's a lot of work, so where should we start?
You talked about one of the articles or papers you read where the educator surveyed their students at the beginning of the school years. And I think it doesn't necessarily need to be an academic survey. It could be a survey to understand students' likes and dislikes about school and ways they want to learn and ways that they learn best, I think. That kind of seems like a good starting point.
Yeah, right. The student voice. I think that's a great place to start. We need to know what our students need, right? That's a big thing we always hear when we're sitting down in professional developments, right? How are you meeting your students' needs? And a lot of people, and I'm guilty of this myself, it's my 4th year of teaching. I'm still, a little wet behind the ears, is I didn't ask that. It's if you want to know what the students need, ask them. Just get out there and be like, hey, how would you like to be graded? How would you like me to assess your work?
There's such a shift at that intermediate secondary learning. As a kindergarten teacher, I'm handing out parent surveys. Tell me what your kids need to learn. And as they grow and develop as a student, I think it's so important. Their parents aren't as involved when they're younger. Once they have that independence, I think putting them in charge of their own learning and telling us what they need is huge.
Yeah. And, and we talk about this diversity and we talk about our own practices, right? And, we've been grading our students on these standardized exams in New York for, decades now, right? But how has our assessment practice changed? It hasn't. Right.
In my 4 years, we haven't really changed any of ours.
Right. And if you remember taking a Regents exam.
Whew,
and,
or do I?
You've seen the modern ones.
Yep.
They're the same. They look exactly the same. Right. Even down to how they fill out the categories, the number of categories, the number of questions. They're the same. But as we already discussed, our students aren't the same. And this is from an article titled "A Desirable but Difficult Goal: Equitable Assessment." That's from Bosker and Izai, where he talks about this. The primary challenge in getting a more equitable landscape is getting these big changes in our assessment practices done. And if we want our exams to match the student needs, why don't we just ask the students, right? And so that's a great place to start, right? But you need to follow through as the teacher, right? And so let's talk about some things that we can make sure we're doing before we go any further and talk about the new work, right? Let's talk about the things we're probably already doing, something that is very ingrained into your work that already is helping us get equity in the classroom. And that's, IEPs, 504s, right? Intervention plans.
Yep.
That are giving these students supports.
Specific goals.
Right. And on the surface, it might not seem fair that Tommy gets 3 hours for the exam when Jane only gets an hour and a half, right?
Yeah.
But that's what Tommy needs. Jane is done with her exam in 45 minutes. And she scores well, so we don't need to put the extra time onto Jane's exam. But what you see a lot in science is that, and maybe you can back this up, is when the exams come, the IEPs are carried out, right? The kids go to the separate room, right? The small groups are in small groups. The kids who get extra time. But when we're doing lab work, when we're doing practical assessments, are those IEPs still being carried out? Are teachers still carrying them out with fidelity, right? Does it even seem feasible, right? If I have all my lab equipment in one room, to set up a smaller lab in a separate room so those kids can have those separate environments, right? It's more work for me. I'm not getting paid to do that extra work. But if I'm not doing that, am I being fair to all my students? Is there justice in the way I'm teaching? Or am I robbing students of an opportunity? A lab's an assessment, right?
Yeah.
And I lost you there for a second. Sorry. So these modifications need to be met. So we need to make sure that we are carrying those out with fidelity. And speaking of labs, right, we can always see, instead of handing kids that pen and paper, We can hand kids a project. We can hand kids something to model, something to show us, right?
I think that's really important. You give them the hands-on experience. Yes, they're doing labs and practicals, but like give them the opportunity to display their learning. I just think it's unique for every student. Your example with finding an animal in your community where you live.
And we did just that in one of my classrooms this year. I am not the only Regents biology teacher. We have been given a pretty strict curriculum to follow. And our first learning segment was all about natural selection, right? And not to toot my own horn, but that's what I did for my assessment. I sort of scrapped what I was given from the curriculum, and I allowed my students to find an animal that they were interested in. And now it didn't have to be in their community, and it doesn't always have to be. It's still student voice if you just let them choose. There isn't a such thing as an organism that doesn't undergo natural selection, right? I mean, from the smallest germ to the blue whale swimming out there in the ocean, they're all under natural selection. And what we saw when I compared my students' assessment data and their attitudes toward the assessment, because I gave them an exit survey about how they liked it.
Okay.
Was when I compared that, right? And I looked at grades for other students in other schools in the RCSD. We've got, 20, 30 something schools. They open and close so often, I lose track sometimes. We saw higher scores in the modeling based, and sure, it took longer, but the retention was higher when we did a more traditional exam. We still have to do a little bit of Regents prep. And the students felt more comfortable with it. They could walk me through it and explain it, right? And that brings us to another great part of equitable assessment, which is the feedback.
I was just about to ask. You said you gave them an exit survey about what they liked, what they didn't like. Mm-hmm. How can we use that feedback?
So student feedback to the teacher.
Sure.
Extremely valuable, right? We already talked about polling our students, right? We're getting that student voice. If I did that assessment and I got a feedback that was like, hey, this was really great, but I feel like it put too much reliance on my abilities as a creative, my ability to draw, right? And I always tell my kids I don't grade on artistic greatness, right? If I tried,
this would have been an art class. That's what I'm.
If I tried to draw a Galapagos finch, it would look like a tiny little blob with a triangle sticking out of its mouth. But if that was the feedback I got, you could sit down with that student and say, let's think about something else you could do. Would you feel more comfortable? Maybe they want to do something like we're doing right now. They want to sit down and they want to just talk about it. As long as it meets the standard, you can work with the student and you can make that work. There's no rule that says we have to give a pen and paper test in 90% of our work, right? And we might not see big change in big, corporate Regents type exams, but if we can give those opportunities at the classroom level, we can still create waves and create great change.
So to kind of finish us off for the listener, really, I'm a educator who just finished listening to this podcast. I walk into my classroom tomorrow morning. What can I do? What is my first step at making these meaningful?
The first step is reflection, right?
Okay.
A lot of us have been told by our districts, here's how we want you to teach. And we sometimes feel like we're walking on eggshells and we have to do what we've been told, right? Because at the end of the day, this is our job. This is our livelihood, right? Everybody else has to do what their managers tell them, and we're no different, right? But also like some of the older teachers, when, 20 years ago, the practices we have now, they showed dividends. They worked, right? But like I said earlier, our diversity, our culture has changed, and we need to change too. So you need to ask yourself, have I changed Am I meeting my students where they are? Am I letting them be a part of this environment? Or am I just sort of walking them through it and saying, look at that tree, right? Or am I letting them come in and explore the environment? Am I letting them be an active participant in the environment, right? Once you've reflected, if you realize that you could do better, you can make some change, and we can always be better, we can always change. You need to get the students involved. You need them to be able to see why their learning is important to them, right? That's a huge step to this, and it's hard. That buy-in is hard. It's not something that is going to be the same for every teacher. There is no one answer. You need to get the students engaged. You need to know what they need, right? We're talking about their needs. And then you need to synthesize a product that is going to meet those needs, right? If I am teaching a bunch of non-white students, I probably can't teach them the same way I grew up, right? We grew up in a district that is 96% white to this day, right? The things that work for me aren't going to work for them. So we need to find out what will, right? So I'm going to ask the listener, I'm going to say, get out there, find what works for your students. Find what makes them feel seen, what makes them feel valued, and reflect that in your work, in their work. Provide them with a proper pathway to success. Give them feedback as they work through it, and let them learn as you assess them. Don't assess their learning. Learn while you assess. All right? That has been another episode of the planning period. Get out there and make some change.